Good evening. The sunset is so beautiful. Why, if I were the sun, I would simply stare in all directions with deep stoicism for billions of years, while periodically rearranging my magnetic field lines and exploding with vast amounts of radiation and plasma. That's what I would do if I were the sun. Before we start today, I just wanted to say that I and my co hosts, Luis and Jeff, are each individuals. We each have our own opinions and political orientations. We often disagree. In fact, we will even passionately disagree. So I just want to make it abundantly clear that if one of my co hosts says or does anything online or in real life, it doesn't mean I had anything to do with it at all. Thank you. There are flying flapjacks, and then there are flying saucer flapjacks. Two very different flapjacks, but both probably don't taste very good. Telesma Blue Orb returns, figuratively, through a process of figurative lampshade hanging. Plus, Arrow, just kidding, there will be no news stories on Arrow ever again because I'm just bored of talking about Arrow. But what about disclosure advocates say, well, that's about 10 times more boring. There will be no more stories on Arrow or disclosure advocates. David Grush, eat your pancakes. All this and more tonight. I'm Rachel Nelson.
I'm Jeff Knox.
And this is UFO Sunset. Welcome. And now for the rebrief. A near-Earth object may have come from the moon. In a new paper published in Nature Astronomy on the 19th with lead author Yifei Zhao, a team of researchers from China and other countries conclude that the near-Earth object called 469219 Kamo'o Aleva, or simply Kamo'o Aleva, may have been ejected from what is now Giordano Bruno crater. And this is a crater 22 kilometers or 14 miles wide on the far side of the moon that formed recently in the moon's geological history. It's named after the 16th century Italian philosopher Giordano Bruno, who proposed that stars are like the sun and have planets orbiting around them. Researchers at Haleakala Observatory in Hawaii discovered Kamo'o Aleva in 2016. Excuse my pronunciation. Its Hawaiian name means oscillating celestial object. The object is between 40 to 100 meters or 31 to 320 feet, 28 feet wide. Its orbit around the Sun is about the same as that of the Earth, as it travels in large loops around the Earth outside of its gravitational sphere of influence, and it is one of only a few dozen objects with similar characteristics. Spectroscopic analysis of the object shows that it has similar properties to that of the Moon. According to the new paper's abstract, quote, "Here we use numerical simulations to demonstrate that Kamo'o Aleva's physical and orbital properties are compatible with a fragment from a crater larger than 10 to 20 kilometers formed on the Moon in the last few million years." Unquote. The authors hope the hypothesis that Kamo'o Aleva originated from the Giordano Bruno impact event will be tested by China's Tianwen-2 space mission to return samples from the object. Future research may also identify other objects near Earth that have been ejected from the Moon. Doctors say that a man who drove his wife and children off of a cliff suffers from psychotic symptoms. On Wednesday, 2 doctors testified in the murder trial of radiologist Dharmesh Patel. Patel drove a Tesla off of Devil's Slide on Highway 1 in Pacifica, California with his wife and 2 children inside in January of 2023. The fall was 250 feet, but all the family members were rescued without fatality. Doctors Mark Patterson and James Armentrout testified on behalf of Patel, saying that he has major depressive order with psychotic features. Patel's wife, Neha Patel, said that her husband drove off the cliff deliberately, according to Radiology Business. The Los Angeles Times reported that according to District Attorney Stephen Wagstaff, Patel was having a psychotic episode at the time of the incident, and that he believed that his 2 children, aged 4 and 7, were being sex trafficked. Patel seeks to be released from jail for mental health diversion to receive psychiatric treatment for 2 years. The prosecutors in the case argued that Patel actually doesn't have major depressive disorder, but that he is instead schizoaffective, adding that the treatment plan proposed by the defense would be ineffective. A blue rock thrush was sighted for the second time in the US. On last Sunday, Michael Sanchez, a birder from Vancouver, Washington, photographed a blue rock thrush at Hug Point Falls, south of Astoria on the Oregon coast, KOIN6 News reported. The thrush is native to Eurasia, and there is only one previous sighting of the bird from 1997 in British Columbia, KOIN6 News reported. According to Nolan Clements, a PhD student at Oregon State University, the blue rock thrush is not believed to inhabit North America, and it is not known how the bird may have arrived in Oregon. He is quoted as saying, quote, "The report has not passed the scrutiny of the Oregon Bird Records Committee or the American Birding Association Records Committee, both voting bodies that adjudicate natural history records, and so is not an official record yet. I am currently a voting member of the OBRC, and I suspect there will be lengthy discussions about this bird, but my guess is that ultimately this report will be accepted." Unquote. And now for Mr. Jeff Knox.
That's pretty cool. That's local to me for people that don't know, Vancouver, Washington. Today I'm going to be sharing with you guys a pretty classic case, a case that I spent a lot of time digging into over the last few days. Deep in the Knox archives, pulling out rare old documents and materials in my research so that I could learn everything there is to know about space pancakes. All right, so today we're going to talk about the famous Flying Saucer Joe Simonton, and his space pancakes. And I've got a lot of information for you guys, so just bear with me. I probably could have cut it down. You're going to learn more about this case than you ever wanted to possibly know. So this case happened on April 18th in 1961, and it took place in Eagle River, Wisconsin, which is in the northern part of the state there. It's kind of it's in the Land of Lakes region, if you guys are familiar with the butter, Land of Lakes butter and stuff. And it's kind of like a resort town, and his house was kind of across the lake, across from this road, in a kind of a rural area there. And Joe Simonton, he's a 58-year-old plumber. Some people refer to him as a chicken farmer. He was not actually a chicken farmer. He just happened to have chickens at his house. And so he's sitting at his house in his kitchen. He's eating lunch. It's about 11 a.m. in the morning. And his home is 4 miles from Eagle River. And he hears this whining sound that's kind of like a jet. And he's used to jets flying over his house because jets fly over his house before. And he's went and checked on these noises before, and every time it was a jet. So he didn't really think too much of the sound. So he then goes to his kitchen and he deposits his dishes in the kitchen sink there, and you can see his kitchen kind of window behind the guy there. And as he's putting his dishes in the kitchen sink there, he sees something outside of his kitchen window, and now he first kind of thinks it's maybe his roof came off. Right? He thought that his roof maybe blew off, but his roof was green colored, and this thing was kind of like silvery or chrome colored. In fact, he sees this bright chrome color object that's brighter than any chrome that he's actually ever seen before, an object that kind of looks like 2 soup bowls that have been put together. And that's a pretty great illustration I found of it. And this object here it's 30 feet in diameter, it's 12 feet high, and it's got these exhaust pipes, which he says are 6 to 7 inches in diameter, that kind of run along the periphery region there. And he sees it land nearby in his driveway. And you can see kind of his house, and he has his kitchen window, and out there where those guys were investigating, that's his driveway, and this is where this thing kind of landed there. Now, he the idea that this object is a kind of a flying saucer, he says, never crosses his mind because he's not really into the UFO topic. He says he hasn't really read anything about UFOs. And he says that he's barely familiar with the topic. And so he's unafraid. He goes outside to check out on this object. And as he approached it, a hatch opens in the top half of the disc and a man appears in the entryway. This illustration is a little inaccurate. It was actually about probably 5 to 6 feet off the ground. And so it was quite a bit higher up. But in this entryway, he sees this 5-foot tall man. He's wearing a black turtleneck pullover with a white band and a belt. And the trousers has a vertical white band along the side as well. He suggests this means he's an officer. He sees 2 other figures that are also visible inside, and these figures don't have the white band. They are described as being Italian looking. He says they're roughly 125 to 130 pounds in weight, and he estimates they are 25 to 30 years old. He says that the complexion of their skin is slightly, I guess, more dark or olive. I guess that's one of the reasons why he thinks they're Italian. And they're also wearing this kind of form-fitting kind of black cap that covers the top of their head. And it either covers most of their facial hair, or they did not seem to have much facial hair. And this man, he's standing in this hatch here, and he's holding up this jug, which appears to be a metallic water jug. And it's got these kind of like 2 handles on each side. And he makes a gesture as if to drink, as if he wants it filled up, and hands the jug to Joe Simonton. Simonton, and I'll point out, he never actually says a word. This whole encounter, there's just basically these hand signals or these gestures he makes. There's no actual verbal communication this entire time. And so Simonton then takes this jug and he goes into his house. In his basement, he's got this water pump. And he thinks about what he should do, but ultimately just decides, well, they want some water, so let's fill up this jug and take it back up to them and just kind of see what happens. And so he fills it with water. He returns to the man again. Now, as I said, this object is actually a bit higher up, so he has to tiptoe and grab onto the side of the saucer with his left hand for support while he hands the jug up to this man. While he's in this kind of elevated position, he can see on the inside of the object, and he sees there are 3 men total. And he sees there are some control panels. I believe there are about 3 of them. One of these men is working on the control panels, and he pays Simonton no notice or attention at all. Another one of these men is basically, he's cooking what looks to be these kind of little cakes or pancakes or cookies on this flameless grill. Simonton then takes a step back from the craft, and the man takes the jug from him, and then he gives Joe this salute with the back of his hand. It says he puts the tips of his fingers of his right hand up to his forehead and just gives a salute like that. Simonton then decides to give the standard kind of military salute in return. And then he says he doesn't know why he did it, but perhaps it was because he was trying to get them to say something because they hadn't said anything this entire encounter. He makes a motion as if he was eating. And he is intending to actually communicate the question, like, are you guys eating? Because they're cooking the food there. And so he points to the cook, who has ignored him the whole time as well. So the other 2 men never pay any attention to him this entire time. But the officer, he then goes and he picks up 4 of these cakes and he hands them to Joe Simonton. And these cakes are they're 3 inches in diameter by about 2 inches in diameter. Or 3 by 2 inches, and they're perforated with these little kind of small holes. After the man, this officer hands these pancakes to Joe, the hatch kind of seals up. And when this hatch seals up, there are no visible holes or seams. It looks as if there was never been a hatch in the first place. And he makes some, gives an example. It's like, you can no more see holes there than you can see a hole through my hand. Now, this object, sounding like a large generator or an electric motor, flies 20 feet off the ground, then tilts upward at about 45-degree angle and abruptly shoots away to the south, vanishing from sight in about 2 to 3 seconds. Now, he describes the way it moves up off the ground identically to how he describes it landing. He says it's smoothly like an elevator. So when it came in, it sounded like knobby tires on wet pavement, he said, but it came down smooth like an elevator. When it left, it made this loud, large generator electric motor sound, rose up smoothly like an elevator at 20 feet tilted at a 45-degree angle, and then shot off. Now, when it did this, there was this jack pine tree that was kind of behind the object that took the brunt of this blast, which he says it wasn't like an exhaust. There was no fumes, but it was just kind of like this blast of air. And the top 8 to 9 inches of this pine tree kind of snapped back. And then it just snapped right back into place, seemingly unharmed. They found no traces on the ground from any sort of landing. In fact, he decided it must not have actually landed at all. It just kind of hovered there, 5 to 6 feet above the ground. Now, after this thing takes off, he's standing there holding these pancakes. He takes a bite of one of these pancakes, and he says it tastes just like cardboard. And he says he never takes another bite of it again. Says they're not very palatable. However, one person apparently described it as tasting kind of like cornmeal and said it was actually palatable. I do not know actually who that person is. Now, this entire incident, it only lasts no more than 5 minutes. And then it's over. He would go on to tell the story to various people over the next few days, and they would mostly kind of laugh at it or not pay it much attention. There's one note that says he may have told the story to some of his egg cartoners, I guess for his chicken, they bring him egg cartons, who then told the story to the judge, but that actually kind of contradicts the rest of the reporting. What basically happened was that on Friday, this happened on a Tuesday, he went to see the judge at the courthouse and tell a story, but the judge was busy in court and couldn't see him. He ends up calling the judge at 11 p.m. at night. And despite it being late at night, Joe wants to tell him this story. And so he comes over and tells the story to the judge that night. Now, this Judge Frank Wellington Carter, is a local UFO buff, and he actually runs a local UFO club. And he's also a member of the Washington, D.C. group, the National Investigation Committee for Aerial Phenomenon. And so Joe knows this guy's interested in UFOs. This guy also was an amateur magician. He was a ventriloquist, an amateur hypnotist, and he did magic and was a member of some brotherhood of magicians and performed at various events. You can actually see him there with his ventriloquist. So anyway, so he meets up with this guy. And Joe knew that he was a UFO guy. Joe allegedly never went to any of the UFO meetings or groups, but he did attend a public forum that this guy gave on the battle for the moon between Russia and the USA, and knew that he was involved in the UFO community. And so he wanted to tell this guy this story. And so he tells him the story. He gives the judge one of these pancakes, and he immediately passes on a nightcap. Like I said, he meets him at 11 p.m. on April 21st. He mails the letter to Nightcap on April 21st. So he literally wrote this letter and packed off this pancake, shipped it off to Nightcap right after meeting Joe Simonton here and telling him his story. Now, Nightcap, of course, at this point is not really all that interested. They're kind of skittish about occupant reports. They don't want to be seen as being interested in little green men stories. Or contactee stories. In fact, Richard Hall, who is Kehoe, does not respond. Richard Hall, who is Secretary of Nightcap, responds to Judge Carter, and he says, in view of past history of so-called contactee claims and the subsequent exposure of many of them as frauds, we can only adopt a position of extreme skepticism in the present case. If Mr. Simonton is telling the complete truth, it is unfortunate that he will have to suffer from the sins of previous contactee claimants. And he actually gets a bit harsher later in the letter here. He says, you have put us on the spot somewhat by announcing before consulting us that we would analyze the cake and announce the results publicly. In effect, it seems you have expected we would accept Mr. Simonton's story at face value and be willing to link ourselves publicly with it. Again, in the view of the past history of such claims, this would make us appear uncritical indeed. We are engaged in very important liaison work with Congress, which may well lead to hearings on UFOs. And we do not propose to compromise this work for the sake of an unproven and, you must admit, fantastic sounding claim. Accordingly, we do not wish to have any further publicity in connection with this claim unless strong supporting evidence is forthcoming. And they would also, in their Nightcap's newsletter, the UFO Investigator would only kind of publish this short blurb on it about a new contactee claim. The recent spaceman contact claim at Eagle River, Wisconsin, received so much publicity that it unfortunately may lead many to think the UFO mystery a joke. According to Joe Simonton, Eagle River plumber, a flying saucer landed in his yard April 18th, and 3 spacemen gave him some pancakes in exchange for a jug of water. In line with our policy, NICAP will evaluate this report for any real evidence of a contact. To date, no such claims have been proven. Many are frauds or delusions. This sensational news story probably will be used by the Air Force for added ridicule of serious UFO reports. We urge our members to offset any actions by citing the massive documented evidence of UFO reality and putting unproven contact stories in their proper light. So you can see NICAP was not all that really interested, but at this point, the Air Force enters the story. And on April 26th, the case would come to the attention of Project Blue Book head Major Robert Friend after hearing of the report from the Air Defense Sector in Duluth, Minnesota. Friend would then speak to Carter over the phone. And Carter, of course, told him that he sent the report to NICAP. They're going to analyze it. And so Friend, thinking NICAP would play the story up for all it was worth in the press, apparently not knowing NICAP had little interest in doing that, decided to send investigators out to get a handle on the case first. Now it's hard to imagine why Friend would think that NICAP would be interested in taking this bait, since it had already generated quite a bit of ridicule in the press at this point. Further, the Air Force were also no fans of single witness reports. And the reason they really only kind of took this on was because they were hoping to stop NICAP from making some sort of circus out of this. And so in this regards, he ends up getting a hold of Blue Book's scientific advisor, astronomer Jalen Hynek from Northwestern University, who is not that far away in Evanston, Illinois. And they also, some personnel from the 676th Raider Squadron out of Antigua Air Force Station, Wisconsin, were also sent to investigate. Hynek would enlist the help of 2 of his graduate students, Walter Weller and John Tumlin, and they would drive that night. So he called them at, I believe it was 10:45 a.m., and they left at 3:45 that afternoon, and they were in Eagle River by 5:45. So they drove from Evanston to Pewaukee, Wisconsin, where they rented a single-engine plane, I believe a Bonanza, to fly to Eagle River. When they arrived, they get in touch with Bob Sautrin. He's a reporter at the local Vilas County newspaper. And they try and ring up Simonton, but have no luck getting in touch. So they decide to just head out to his property. But Simonton isn't home when he gets there. They eventually track him down at his in the neighborhood at one of the neighbors' houses. When they get there to so they track him down to the neighbor. They take him back to the house, and when they get there, they go around the farm, taking a bunch of pictures of the area, and they examine the pine tree that was hit with the blast of the air. Now Hynek then invites Simonton to dinner, where they would continue this conversation. At dinner, Hynek would note that the local townspeople all seemed to respect Simon, and he would excuse himself then later to go talk to people at the bar to kind of get an idea of what other people were saying in the town. And he said most of them believed his story. There were some that were loud skeptics. Like I said, he was a well-respected member of the community. I guess he played Santa Claus every year for the local Chamber of Commerce, and people considered him a reliable guy who didn't drink. He may not have been the most educated, but they thought he was a fairly reliable guy. Now, when Hynek was over talking to these other guys, his graduate student, Walter Weller, took the opportunity to talk to Judge Carter, but would have very little success in getting the judge to open up. Apparently, because the judge, was a big flying saucer buff, he thought they were from the Air Force, and in a way they were, but they weren't Air Force employees. And the Air Force was considered persona non grata, his own words, amongst the local UFO enthusiasts. Now, Hynek wound up getting Carter to actually open up a bit, and he would actually win Simonton's confidence as well. And Simonton would end up letting him read many of the letters that he had received since the incident. The general tone of these letters was that he should be very careful of trusting the Air Force with any information, and he certainly should be careful of giving them any physical material samples, as he would likely never see them again. And the entire thing would just be hushed up. So Simonton would ask Hynek some kind of questions to kind of gauge where he was with things about his opinion of NICAP and Kehoe. And he must have been satisfied with his answers, because he ended up giving Jalen Hynek one of these samples for Project Blue Book. And that's a picture of the sample there in a display case at Wright-Patterson. Another sample would be given to a different Air Force investigator from the 676th. And a third piece he ends up keeping for himself. Now, apparently there was some other people. There's a guy in Los Angeles that's blacked out that I have no idea who got that sample, and have not had any luck tracking it down. Apparently later on, he would also give a piece to a reporter at KTSP named Bud Meyer. Now, the cake that was given to Hynek would be sent to the Aeronautical Systems Division of the Air Force Systems Command, which was actually a fairly new division. I believe it's just kind of officially started a couple months earlier, but it was a continuation of prior divisions. It's kind of a new name, to analyze the sample, right? And in a Blue Book document, they would indicate that the cake was prepared from a low protein flour with small quantities of sugar and salt and cooked in hydrogenated oil. Another piece of the sample would be given to the Food and Drug Administration of the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, or that's what it was back in 1961 anyways. And they performed a more complex and thorough analysis, but found mostly the same results, that the food was made of terrestrial but tasteless ingredients, including hydrogenated oil and buckwheat flour. In fact, microscopic analysis of the pancakes not only showed like the buckwheat, but the hulls from the buckwheat and various other things indicating terrestrial ingredients. So like I said, it's just normal oil, essentially the same results that was reported by the Aeronautical Systems Laboratory. The sample that NICAP got was first sent to Professor Charles Manny, who was going to have a colleague analyze it, but he was sick and the guy ultimately ended up passing away. So the sample ended up going to Lex Mebane, who was with the Civilian Saucer Intelligence Group of New York. He received the sample from NICAP, and while his tests were preliminary, he also found similar results. There's a lot of controversy about the sample and it not being tested in time, and the judge wanting it back, and that's kind of all long and drawn out, and how NICAP basically did a preliminary sample, but they didn't want to spend a few hundred more dollars, and this is 1961 dollars, to have further tests done, considering it was just going to be a same results as everyone else. They did actually finish testing it, I believe, eventually. And so, again, he found basically the same thing, normal, earthly, hydrogenated cooking oils, as did Bud Meyer, the guy, the reporter, who was also given a sample, who had an opportunity to taste it. He said it wasn't very palatable. He took his sample to be analyzed at the University of Minnesota, and they came up with the exact same results. So, what did the Air Force have to say about this case? Now, the Air Force basically, they conclude the case with an explanation from an anonymous psychologist, also from the Aeronautical Systems Division, who kind of gave an off-the-cuff response, just kind of theorizing. He never talked to Joe, or, he was never actually, analyzed or interviewed by a psychologist. And his suggestion was that, in his opinion, the witness suffered a hallucination and subsequent delusion concerning his experience. These hallucinations may be a one-time experience brought on by circumstances which may never again be present to the individual. They believe that while Simonton was an honest man, he has mistakenly conflated the reality of his breakfast with a waking dream, and he essentially kind of inserted that dream experience into the continuum of his waking memories. So what are we to think about this case? As we pointed out, Simonton was well known and liked in his community. People that knew him well thought him incapable of a deliberate hoax, nor did they think that he was mentally unsound. Unfortunately, that's what people always say. Oh, I don't think I can commit a hoax. I'm not saying that he committed a hoax. But what did Hynek have to say about this? Well, again, Hynek would say he answered questions directly. He did not contradict himself. He insisted the facts would be repeated exactly as he stated them, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. And this is actually kind of a very interesting part of this interesting aspect of the story, is that he actually was very, very specific with repeating his story the same way every time. In fact, when the few kind of copies of him telling his story we have, like in audio or video, he says the exact same sentences in the exact same way. He does not alter or deviate at all with the way he tells his story, which is, you know, kind of interesting. So then Hynek would also recall later on, this is a bit further on in 1975, that he was not at all impressed with him personally or his surroundings. He lived in this sort of shack on the outskirts of town. The man could have been a wino. The yard was sort of unkept, bottles and so forth, but they weren't wine bottles, just untidy. My interpretation at the time was that he had been having pancakes himself for breakfast, suddenly had a waking dream or an isolation delusion. As his views on the UFO phenomenon generally moved in a more positive direction in the years to come, Hynek would consider more seriously the possibility that Simonton had experienced a real encounter. He also told his story to other members of the community, not just the judge. He told it to the local deputy attorney, Clive Burton. He told it to the local sheriff, Joe Schroeder. And Joe, the sheriff would report, Joe really believes everything he says, and he isn't a drinking man. He talks sensibly. The district attorney would say that Simonton sounded sincere, added that he had a good reputation in the community, and told a straightforward story. Simonton told the district attorney he was reluctant to talk about the incident earlier because people might think it was preposterous. Bob Sautrin, the editor of the Vilas County Review, remarked, if you took a vote around here, most people would say Simonton's story is authentic. On the other hand, a number of people who had telephoned to ridicule the story. So there's always a little kind of bit of dissenting view kind of going on. One potential answer for this story might have came from a guy named Harry Pride, a local real estate broker from Eagle River. He would claim that he concocted the story as a yarn with some friends as a publicity stunt to drive up tourism for Eagle River, which was, you know, a resort town after all. He claims they got Joe drunk and then they hypnotized him. While under hypnosis, they made him repeat the story 20 times. I also had 29 times in there, but to make sure he got the details right, and repeated the story the same every single time, which he, in fact, actually did. Pride would then kind of later change the story a bit and say that the original hallucination actually happened. They only actually hypnotized him so that he would be able to repeat the story the same way every time. And while this is potentially plausible, there's no evidence that was ever provided, you know, prove this claim. And not only that, there's at least some anecdotal evidence that it was false and it was a joke, because the judge actually knew Harry Pride. And he spoke to Harry Pride and told him that this lady, Cynthia Hess from APRO and Nightcap, was telling the story that he had hypnotized people. And Harry Pride told the judge that it was preposterous, that it was a lie, that like it didn't happen. And now the judge did think that Harry Pride might have been pulling a prank on this lady, this Hess lady, and did actually tell her that, but that the story is false. They didn't hypnotize anyone. In fact, he says the Harry Pride doesn't know how to hypnotize anyone, and he doesn't know anyone that could hypnotize someone, except perhaps the judge, because he was a hypnotist. Anyway, so we can probably dismiss kind of that case there as the explanation. He probably wasn't hypnotized. In fact, there is some potential corroboration that comes in from an insurance agent and a scoutmaster named Savino Borgo, who at roughly the same time as Simonton claimed he saw a saucer while driving on Highway 70, roughly a mile from Simonton's home. Borgo said the object rose diagonally and then flew west parallel to the highway. Unfortunately, this case did not seem to be investigated, and it was only briefly mentioned. In fact, I'm not even sure where it was reported to, because I could not find it in any newspaper articles. It was kind of just mentioned by APRO, so perhaps it was mentioned to APRO. So what's the aftermath out of this? Like, what did did Simonton really have anything to gain about it? Because people said, he had nothing to gain. There was no benefit for him doing this. And in fact, he would tell people that he actually suffered from this. He said he was unable to go to work for 3 weeks, and he's going to have to start making money somehow. that all the people basically calling all the time, and this got major coverage. Newsweek called people, people from around the country called, and this was a big major story. And so I can imagine a lot of people coming by might have interrupted with his ability to do his plumbing work. It was also kind of published that these chickens of his died, 20-something chickens died after the encounter. But ultimately, it was kind of determined that they were malnourished, and there were no, and there were some indications that they were kind of actually already dead, or some of them are already dead, and that he had failed to bury them, and they had just been laying and left out in the yard. So I'm not sure we can tie those chickens directly to this kind of encounter. But he would say that if he had another UFO sighting, he would keep it to himself. He would then go on, though, to publish this little pamphlet of his, The Story of the Flying Saucer. It was essentially like a one-page, 3-part pamphlet that he sold for $1. There's some evidence that perhaps later sold them for $3. And in fact, I found one event that he was speaking at where he sold 29 of these in one evening at this dinner. The local Chamber of Commerce would also go on to name him Man of the Year. He would travel around to tell his story on the lecture circuit for a bit. He was the main speaker at an annual space age convention in Mountain View, Missouri. That, I believe, that may be the Buck Nelson convention that he went to in June 1963. In April 1962, Simonton would be the guest of honor with Aunt Jemima at a big Pancake Day event staged by the Rhinelander Lions Club. Rhinelander is basically the nearest kind of larger town to Eagle River. Now, who cares what we think, right? Like, what does Simonton have to think about this case? Now, he kind of became disgusted. He said, again, if it happened again, he didn't think he would tell anyone about it. But, he would actually see something again. And a ufologist named Lee Alexander from a Detroit UFO group in 1970 claimed that he visited Simon, who told him that he had a few more alien visits, but chose to keep them quiet. But however, he was in the news again. Now, I couldn't find the actual news article. I just found a later news article that referenced it. Because in August that year, August 1961, he supposedly saw 2 UFOs for about an hour, for about half an hour with a neighbor of his named Mike Fredrickson. So he did have another sighting later that year. And in fact, in addition to that sighting that that Borgo guy had at roughly the same time, there was some people that said they saw a UFO in the area a few days later. And then there was another sighting that was a bit more well-known of some boys and a family on the 27th that also saw a UFO in the area. So there was some other UFO sightings contemporarily at the time. So what did Simonton kind of, think about the case himself? What did he think the things actually were? So he believed that these men were from outer space. And this is his kind of fairly interesting logic and reason he gave for this. The men in the saucer resembled us here on Earth, but there was something a little different about their dress and their expression, and above all, their food. If they ate the pancakes like they gave me, their taste sure was different from mine. To me, these pancakes tasted like cardboard. If you don't know what cardboard tastes like, just take a bite out of it and see for yourself. All countries here on Earth have rations to carry and with them for food, and when they go in the field and are on long trips, they don't cook the food as they go. I think that is enough reason to think they're from outer space. So according to Joe, their food tastes bad, and there's no reason they would have been cooking food. They must be from space. And who are we to disagree with Flying Saucer Joe? Because as Joe would say himself, I don't care what anyone says, but I know what I saw. And this is a very interesting case. It's one of these cases that it's hard to know what to do with it, right? Like, it's, on one hand, are we to believe extraterrestrials came down here to eat very terrestrial, boring buckwheat pancakes? So given that, it's very hard to not call it a hoax. To me, the psychological explanation, while plausible, isn't entirely satisfactory either. It's just one of those kind of strange, weird, fun anomalies that you have in the UFO community, in the UFO literature. That's an interesting story. And, it's really kind of just up to you on what you want to believe. I'm going to try and bring up a quick video here. Let's see if this works real quick here. It's 3 minutes long. And it's just Joe telling a story real quick. You can hear it in his own words, and you kind of decide for yourself what you want to believe.
Flying saucer, this UFO landed right here about where I'm standing. And it was a big, huge thing, and I wondered what the heck it was. I was in my kitchen having a bite of lunch, and I turned around, put the dishes in the sink, and I looked out the window, and that's when I first saw this thing coming straight down, just like an elevator. And first I thought the roof went off of my house, and I thought, no, the roof is green, and this is bright. What the heck is it? So I rushed out to see what it was, and by that time, there was a hatchway opening up in the top of it, just like the trunk of your car. And in there stood a little man, I say a little man, about 5 foot tall, holding up a jug or a container, and he motioned he wanted to drink. He motioned for water. So I walked up to him to get this jug, and I looked at his eyes, and they were so penetrating that I had to look away. So I went to the basement to get this water, and I thought, well, they want water, so I'll take it up to them and see what happens. And with that, I brought the water up, and he was looking at me when I first came out of the basement. But I didn't look at his face until I got right up to him. Then I looked up, and I handed the jug up with both hands, and I had that same look in his eyes, a sort of a penetrating look. And when he took the water, I balanced myself with this hand against the machine, and I stepped back a few steps. And then with that, he set the jug down, and he gave me a salute with the back of his hand, a gesture of thanks, I presume. And then, well, I gave him my salute. What am I going to do? So I noticed this little man, same size of a man, right to the right side of the hatchway, cooking these pancakes, which I have one here yet. He was frying these pancakes, and I pointed to him and made a gesture like eating. I thought maybe I'd get a conversation out of him. Nobody was saying anything. But he didn't say a word. He just reached over and he got a handful of them, 4 of them, and he handed them down to me. And they were hot and greasy. And this man cooking these pancakes, it was on a square grill-like concern. I couldn't see any flame, but it seemed to be very hot. There was smoke coming from it. And if that was their food, God help them, because I took a bite of one of them, and it tasted like a piece of cardboard. And if that's what they lived on, no wonder they're small. And with that, he reached up and he closed this hatch with a heavy thud click like when it latched. And you couldn't a bit more see where that hatch was than you could see a hole in my hand. And with that, the thing started to raise just like it came down. Everything was time perfect. It went up about 20 feet. It tilted at 45 degrees straight south and shot off. And within 2 or 3 seconds, it was out of sight. Well, there I stood in the driveway with a handful of greasy pancakes and my mouth open, wondering what the heck I saw, what had happened.
It is outside the realm of the Air Force to pass judgment on Mr. Simonton's case. However, the pancakes that he turned over to the Air Force were turned over to the Food and Drug people, and they were analyzed as pure buckwheat pancakes.
Joe Simonton of...
So, that's Simonton in his own words. You can find a video if you check my thread on Twitter or Facebook, where there's another copy of him telling his story later on, and it's pretty much identical. As far as whether or not he had any buckwheat around, there's no evidence figuratively or literally that he cooked up this story. So no, that there's no evidence he had buckwheat around that I'm aware of. There's some of the people suggested the pancakes might have actually been cooked with beaver grease because one of his neighbors, I guess, was a famous trapper, and that's why they were kind of. So these pancakes were also kind of very rubbery and hard. And the judge actually said it kind of smelled and tasted like goose grease that his mother used to put on when he was sick. So, yeah, I don't know that there was any evidence that he had any buckwheat. I don't think so. They said there was no evidence he cooked them up himself. So, if you're curious what the pancakes are to this date, there is still I guess the nightcap sample is now in the hands of the National UFO Historical Record Center with David Marler. He still has a tiny little kind of piece of it. And then the piece that Blue Book has is in that kind of display case, which apparently you can still visit at Wright-Patterson to see. I'm tracking down supposedly another copy of a piece somewhere. But I haven't heard back from that yet. So all I know is that if I had the piece of pancake, I would eat it and report back to you guys to let you know, because how can you not eat a space pancake? Anyways, back to you, Rachel.
Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome.
As I talked a little bit about in our last episode, when we talk about folk beliefs, it is not necessarily to take them as though they are automatically false. Instead, one can decide to try to investigate the reality behind the belief. Or, if you don't have the time and want to slap a TLDR on there, you can simply say, well, this is something they believe, but I don't believe it. And again, as I said last week, this is not an idea that I came up with. It comes from a 1977 paper by David Hufford. But let's develop this idea further with another concept I was introduced to by the fictional character Telesma Blue Orb in one of the entries from her diary correspondence that is basically too weird for me to share publicly. And that is the concept of lampshading legend. Now, the following are basically Telesma's words, not my own. But seeing as how she's a fictional character, I guess we could say that I channeled her in writing the following account. I'm just going to lampshade that in there, and also, while I'm at it, lampshade that I'm lampshading. Moreover, I'm lampshading that I'm lampshading that I'm lampshading. And I think I might have stumbled on an infinite regress of lampshades, so let's put a pin in that. And let me just say really quick before we start, because Telesma didn't bother to do this for whatever reason. I don't know, maybe because she's an orb, or maybe because she's a fictional character. Anyway, a legend is just a story that some people believe and other people don't. If we can't agree that King Arthur really existed, for example, we may call him legendary. Now, with the above lampshades in mind, Telesma writes, quote, Dear Rachel, I've come to realize that the term lampshading can be used, at least by me or anyone else if they want to, I suppose, not just to describe fiction. It also has everything to do with UFOs. The term lampshading, or more technically, lampshade hanging, is a type of device used in fiction. From tvtropes.org, quote, This practice is also known as hanging a clock on it, hanging a lantern on it, or spotlighting it. In the film industry, it's sometimes called hanging a red flag on something after the screenwriting adage. To hang a red flag on something takes the curse off of it, meaning that to lampshade something decreases the negative effects it might otherwise have. Teodolinda Barolini referred to this as the Garian principle, in reference to how Dante narrates how unbelievable his true story is the more fantastical it gets, unquote. And the definition from Wiktionary.org reads, quote, to intentionally call attention to the improbable, incongruent, or cliched nature of an element or situation featured in a work of fiction within the work itself." Unquote. An example of lampshading is when Kermit the Frog points out that there's a running gag happening with the telephone backstage on The Muppet Show. Floyd Pepper comes and tears the phone from the wall, at which point Fozzie says, quote, "Well, I guess that's an end to the running gag." Unquote. In Lucian's ancient Greek novel, A True History, he uses lampshading with ironic absurdity. As he describes in vivid detail the ranks of alien species in a great interstellar battle, he says of the Nephelocentaurs, colossal flying centaurs, that they were, quote, "of such multitude that I was fearful to set down their number, lest it might be taken for a lie. And for their leader they had the Sagittarius out of the zodiac." Unquote. So what does lampshading have anything to do with UFOs? Well, the interesting thing is, listeners, most things have something to do with UFOs, because UFOs have to do with just about everything. And this example of lampshading is an illustration of that. I have lampshaded the incongruity of talking about UFOs in a narrative context by talking about UFOs in a narrative context. We'll leave aside the claim that I myself am in fact a UFO, but not without calling that out first as well. As we can see when discussing the relationship between fact and legend, it is often very convenient to simply lampshade where incongruities in whatever story one happens to encounter emerge. But simply because I have lampshaded the discussion of UFOs is enough to determine some connection to UFOs, however indirectly. The cautious listener will note that simply mentioning UFOs does not automatically form any direction to UFOs themselves, of course. Yet really, most any discussion of UFOs is not going to be directly concerned with any UFOs themselves. This is because a UFO report very rarely stands as evidence of some object unexplained to science moving through the air or through space, literally. And when it does, there is no way for anyone to know for sure. While there are those strange lights that are known to exist in the lower Earth atmosphere, such as the Heston lights or ball lightning. Quick aside, well, actually, I don't really believe this per se anymore, though in fact I did at the time that the fictional character Telasma Blue Orb was writing this. But in any case, what other types of unexplained physical phenomena in the atmosphere might exist is really outside of the domain of human understanding. So, whenever anyone talks about UFOs, they are actually talking about the idea of UFOs. If I give an example of a UFO, any physically existing UFO, I am ultimately talking about a hypothetical, theoretical, or imaginary UFO. So in any discussion where we are talking about UFOs, it is often very useful to lampshade in accurate contextual information. And this is because whether or not UFOs exist as objective phenomena that can sometimes be observed by humans, all such UFOs, as well as any of the potentially fictional kind, only exist in legend for humans. There are not many long-lasting unexplained UFO reports, but those reports that do exist are legendary, in some sense, because the true external stimuli that cause those reports cannot be identified. Previously, I discussed the idea of the human paranormal interface, describing it as a top-down faculty for processing legendary experiences, and I defined legend not in terms of stories that people tell, but in terms of experience and perception, as opposed to legends that we encounter in the form of stories. In the school of psychology called Gestalt psychology, the mind's experiences are studied as a whole. The word Gestalt describes a whole that is larger than the sum of its parts. The human mind experiences the world not as individual percepts, but as a structured whole. For an example of this, in episode 5 of The Earth, Jeff Knox recounts seeing anthropomorphic mice in his bedroom. While these were almost certainly drug-induced hallucinations, he describes the mice as appearing in a particular location in his environment. If the hallucination was not placed in his perceptual environment, it might have simply drifted in and out of his field of vision or been partially transparent. Many hallucinations, such as seeing stars or auras, have no visual depth and simply appear over the three-dimensional visual field, moving with one's gaze. Why then should a hallucination appear as though a 3D object within one's external environment? I previously defined apparitions as a category of experiences that, like hallucinations, do not appear to represent physical objects or events in one's environment. But unlike other hallucinations, using my definition, apparitions are very personally meaningful to the individual, such as seeing a dead loved one or having a near-death experience. They are typically accompanied with strong emotions and may become an important episode in a person's accounting of their own life. However, in these types of experiences, objects and presences may again often be located within the experiencer's perceived environment. David Hufford gives numerous examples of how apparitions may be located within one's external environment, interacting with it, or even influencing the environment, such as by illuminating the surroundings by glowing. For example, from this first-person account, quote, "Well, the first time I was at my girlfriend's house and I had been sleeping. I went to bed early that night and I woke up, but yet I couldn't move. I was paralyzed, but I was lying on my back and I could see everything that was in the room. I could see my girlfriend sleeping on her bed, and that's just the way it went for not long. It wasn't long when all of a sudden a bright shiny light came into her bedroom. It was like right at her bedroom door, just all of a sudden, it was there. And I just saw it and I just started screaming inside. I could feel myself inside screaming. And then all of a sudden, I saw my girlfriend get out of bed. I saw her come over, and as soon as she touched me, it was gone and I could move. And she said to me, 'What are you doing?' And I just tried to explain it to her, but she couldn't understand it. I was scared. For the rest of the night, I was scared." Unquote. It is quite common in sleep paralysis experiences like this to hear reports of all sorts of details that place apparitions in one's external environment. This, along with how sharp and realistic the experience is, give the distinct impression that the one having the experience is awake. These experiences are also commonly terrifying, or else invoke other deep emotional responses. They are Gestalt experiences because the apparitions one encounters are integrated into one's perceptual environment and evoke deep emotions. This is all to say that while I may not be able to substantiate the existence of the HPI to humans, proving that it exists, I can show that experiences of apparitions and hallucinations are often structured in such a way that otherworldly apparitions are perceived as a regular part of one's physical environment. Apparitions may appear to people just as anything else would. They are often placed in the world of the people who experience them. So whether or not the mind has evolved to specialize in fabricating legendary experiences, which I honestly think is more parsimonious at this point, we can say that human minds do with some frequency create fully lifelike experiences of things that can only be described as legendary. And when I say legendary here, I again mean legendary in a perceptual sense. What the mind perceives in these instances is at odds with the contents of mundane experiences, appearing to have arisen out of some other world, such as an afterlife or a world of other non-human entities. And returning to the lampshade, legend is also, of course, a property of a story. If a story is generally accepted, then it's considered as a factual or non-fiction story. But if one cannot tell how much truth the story contains, if any, then it becomes legendary. The reports of people's perceptions are much the same as the reports from people's mouths. We can assign a value of accuracy or of reliability to any of them, and in any case, whether I perceive something directly or I hear it from someone else, I can only make a judgment of how probable the report is based on the available evidence. The UFO experience is not the experience of UFOs. It is really the report of UFO-like experiences that occurs in the mind's perceptions. It is quite possible for someone to think that they saw an unidentified flying object or even an alien spacecraft. It is even possible for someone to see the apparition of a UFO or some otherworldly flying light or object. But just as the reports of UFOs are all in some way legendary, the experiences of UFOs are on a more fundamental level also legendary, just in a different sense. They are things that the mind perceives that may very well not be there, or that may not represent what the mind thinks that they represent. Because of this, lampshading is very much deeply connected to UFOs, insofar as lampshading is a very useful tool if we want to talk about and understand UFOs. Lampshading in this context simply means pointing out the facts of any given UFO case, or even any given type of hypothetical UFO. It often just means pointing out what it is being discussed is a true story. The story came from this particular source, and it exists in the historical or cultural context. Or if one is reporting their own experience, then lampshading may simply mean that they are stating that they are reporting their own experience, and to take that as it may. I don't know if people actually saw luminous owls around Norfolk in the 1900s. This is a topic I'll have to discuss another time. But what I can say is that there are all of these different news clippings and magazine articles from the time, all of which report luminous owls. And the science supports the idea that barn owls rely on flashing prey with moonlight in order to stun them. So we can just put a lampshade on it and call it good. Nobody has to draw any false conclusions or assume that I believe that the stories happened as they were reported. I've separated myself from the story by pointing out where it's come from, and then treated the story as containing legendary components. To lampshade is to point out what we know about the legend, and that way one can more easily pick out the very muddy parts of the legend. Because of this, lampshading is actually a really invaluable tool for talking about UFOs. What do you think, listeners? What do you think, Rachel? Love, Telesma Blue Orb. Well, unquote. Well, thanks, Telesma. I love you too. And now I am very self-conscious. And I wish you had revised this letter more before you sent it to me. Fictionally speaking, you didn't really synthesize these ideas of lampshading, legendary stories, and legendary experiences very well, in my opinion, into a single cohesive composition. I even had to go back and add some of my own bracketed notes to the script, just so that listeners at home wouldn't get confused. But what I can expect from what can I expect from a 9-dimensional bog light who's fictional? Anyway, as I mentioned from the outset, when we encounter a folk belief, say in the form of a legend that someone purports to be true but that we believe is false, we can, as Hufford suggested, simply lampshade that fact. Or if I have an experience that doesn't fit with my other experiences because it's very uncanny or unaccountably strange, in other words, if I have an experience that is legendary to my own mind, then I can simply lampshade that. In other words, I can say, well, the weirdest thing happened to me the other day. I saw time inside of a bottle in a cloud or something. I don't know if this actually happened in my external environment or if it's just something that happened in my internal experience. But in any case, this is what happened, right? This is sort of like saying, I know it sounds crazy, or you're not going to believe me, but, and then talking all about the big fish that you caught doing inappropriate things in the bathroom. In this case, we're not lampshading fiction. In this case, we're not lampshading fiction to point out that it's a fabrication, but we're just doing the same exact thing with an experience, except to point out that it sounds absurd, but it nonetheless happened in some sense, lampshading a legendary experience.
So is lampshading, would that be pointing out like the incongruent and kind of ridiculous aspects of Joe Simonton's story, like the fact that they came here and traded water for pancakes, or that aliens would be coming here in the first place to eat crappy tasting buckwheat pancakes?
Yeah, I mean, it would just be, contextualizing the story, providing contextual details to be like, because, I mean, with Joe Simonton, we can't really know like what he actually experienced, but for him, telling the story,
Yeah, we have the pancake in his story. That's it. No other physical evidence. And that pancake right there, that in fact is the pancake that still exists and is with David Marler and the National, Historical Record Center down there in New Mexico.
It's really cool.
That piece is still there and it's still around, and oh no, remove. So, and I did remember Joe Simonton's piece that he still had actually, unfortunately, was destroyed. The house basically burnt down a few years later, and then they kind of had to rebuild the house. And when the house burnt down, that piece was lost. So, yeah, it's an interesting story, and I've shared pretty much all the documents I can find that was ever written on this. And this story was actually also it was so well known that Jack Webb adapted it in his TV series Project UFO in the late 70s in an episode called The Dollhouse Incident. And I've linked to that as well.
Yeah.
And I've just recently today shared this article that was in Fate magazine about it. I'll be scanning the 2 articles in these old issues of Ray Palmer's Flying Saucers that relate, like this one on hypnosis. And for anyone that is interested in this whole idea of, entities feeding people, with whether, it's like fairies or aliens or like Sasquatches, you can check out this book by, I don't even know how to pronounce the last name, Joshua Cutchin.
Yeah, I think that's correct.
A Trojan Feast, the food and drink offerings of aliens, fairies, and Sasquatch. And it's got a foreword by the excellent Eddie Ballard there. And he talks all about the different kind of times people have been given food samples by these entities. And I guess even Sasquatch gives you food. Apparently they give you meat, although there are stories of Sasquatch giving, like, basically they will, if it's like bread, they steal it and stuff. They steal bread and cheese from the local village and bring it back to you. But I guess Sasquatches prefer to give you the meat. Fairies, the bread is the famous thing, the fairy loaf or the fairy bread. And in fact, in the Project UFO episode, instead of these pancakes, he basically gets this loaf of bread that he cuts pieces off of to give to like the Air Force and other people. But yeah, and this the story that was actually in Fortean Times, a few years ago that I also kind of linked to is actually an excerpt from this book. So you can just get the book if you're interested in all the weird stories of entities feeding people. So
yeah, I have not read that book. I've wanted to for a long time, but I've just not had the chance to yet.
I guess with fairies though, the thing is when they feed you, that typically like precedes something else, right? Like a loss of memory or like a trip or something like that. Like it's Joe Simonton, I guess, got off pretty easy with just a crappy tasting pancake that he tasted. There was no trip to Magonia or anything that he had to deal with. So
Yeah, I think a really common motif is that if you eat the food of the fairies or of the underworld, then it basically traps you there. Like with Persephone eating the like pomegranate seed or something like that, that causes her to become trapped in the underworld for part of the year.
half the year or whatever it is. Yeah.
Yeah. So
It's it's pretty interesting. I like this name. Judge Carter actually came up with this name for NICAP because he was kind of irritated at NICAP. Instead of NICAP, he said it's NSAP, the National Suppression of Aerial Phenomena, because he thought they were all part of the cover-up. Kind of like at that point. And I said I didn't really get a chance to get to it, but there's like a lot of drama kind of going on between NICAP and other people surrounding this sample, right? Like, and the fact that he sent it to them and he didn't get the results as quickly as he wanted, and the fact that they didn't want anything to do with it, but they did eventually test it. And there's just one more thing I wanted to point out. I've kind of forgot to mention that I thought was interesting was about the eyes. One of the things you hear a lot about like abductions is that people say like those eyes, like you look in, they kind of like steer right through you, like into your soul, right? And like back in 1961, Joe Simonton essentially says the same kind of thing here. He says their eyes looked right down to the bottom of your shoes. Do you understand? When they looked into your eyes, well, you just couldn't stand to look at them for long. They seemed to do something to you.
wow,
I thought that was really interesting because you'll hear that a lot in later abduction stories. Like I haven't done any looking, but I'd like to see when people first started talking about eyes in that manner, like in occupant encounters, because that does seem to at least be a fairly early encounter, anyways.
Yeah.
So, yeah. But it's a unique story in the regards that it might be the only story where we actually have physical evidence of the food. There's plenty of stories of people saying they've been fed food, but they drank food, but they drank it, they consumed it. They don't have anything with them to test. This may be the only time where there was actually the real food that we could look at and test, at least in the UFO literature. And from just skimming Kitchen's work, I didn't see any other mention of any other case. So, and while that the results were entirely, kind of terrestrial, that seems to be a kind of a trend in analyzing anything supposedly from an extraterrestrial craft, whether it's a piece of debris that is supposedly from a craft that upon being analyzed turns out to be normal terrestrial metals, nothing, interesting or unusual about it. It seems every time we get our hands on a piece of physical evidence, it turns out to have a terrestrial origin, whatever that means.
Yeah, something that struck me too was that they were made two things. They were made out of regular ingredients. But the other thing too that was really interesting was that people were saying that the oil smelled funny, but it was just regular hydrogenated oil. I thought that was really an interesting detail, that people like the judge was saying that it tasted like goose grease, or smelled like goose grease.
Smelled like goose grease, because I guess his mom used to put it on him when he was sick or something. And he said it had to smell just like old goose grease that his mom used to put on him when he was sick or something.
Yeah, that's really fascinating.
And other people, like I said, speculated it was actually beaver oil. And that's because people are trying to figure out why this pancake, because when the judge held the pancake up and he kind of bent it, he's like, this is really like flexible. It's like rubbery, right? Like it's like a normal pancake would break. Like he's like, what's going on with this pancake? But Carol Lorenzen, who was the director and founder of APRO, the Aerial Phenomenon Research Organization, I guess was also a bit of a cook, and she did a bunch of experiments to try to kind of recreate these pancakes, and she just used she didn't use buckwheat, she just used kind of like cornmeal and sugar and just other stuff, and she was able to replicate them. She said if you had basically a pan with a shallow pool of oil that's kind of already heated up, and you pour the ingredients into it, she was able to replicate the pancakes, holes and all, like with pretty much any size she wanted to create out of them. So yeah, it's I guess just maybe depending on how you cook them and the ingredients, they end up more rubbery and weird like that. But it's also interesting how there's like, the one person said, the main guy says it's cardboard. Another person said that it was palatable or tasted kind of like cornmeal pancakes. Not the greatest tasting thing, but it wasn't like horrible. And the other guy agreed that it did taste like cardboard. So all the more reason somebody needs to give me a sample so I can taste it. I'll do the empirical human testing, and I'll eat that pancake, and I'll tell you what's up.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
buckwheat isn't even a grain, technically, I guess. I guess buckwheat's not even really a grain. It's like a seed, and it's not even typically used. But
John Payne said, "Is there a distinction between lampshading and speculation?" I don't really understand the question. I'm not sure where he's going with that. What I was saying is that lampshading is providing context for a story, describing, where the story came from, what, people believe about the story, and what the evidence is surrounding the story, that kind of thing.
yeah. Well, we did not have Louise today, so sorry about that, guys, but I had more pancake info than you ever wanted to know in exchange.
Yeah, and Jeff here also eats pancakes every day, puff pancakes. So.
Yes, and I ate pancakes before the show, and they were delicious. They did not taste like cardboard. They were yummy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Oh, one other thing about those guys that I was going to mention about their uniforms that I thought was kind of strange was, so they all essentially wore that same uniform, right? It was kind of like a black kind of overall kind of thing, and they never left the ship. But when he looked in, he could see that they had these kind of suspension wires hooked up to both sides of the uniforms. All three of them had these two wires that were hooked up, kind of like safety or suspension wires that were then connected to these guardrails. I mentioned the inside of the craft was this kind of like dull black color. They described it as like wrought iron, and they saw those control panels, but around these control panels were these steel guards, and hooked up to those guards with these like kind of suspension safety wires that attached to each side of, each of the three people, almost as if, like, I don't know if it was like in zero gravity or something, you needed to be able to be anchored to the ship. Or I don't know, but it was another weird kind of detail that he pointed out that he saw there.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'm going to definitely watch this presentation that you did again later. I thought it was really good.
Thank you. Yeah, I kind of forgot some things and missed some things, and I could have said a lot more, but like I say, that more than covered all the details, and people can just go look at the thread. It's probably fairly complete. Once I post these two other things I'm going to scan, it's probably everything written and published about the case ever. So you can go spend the last, the next 40 hours like I did, like reading every single page over and over again, and blow your brain up with useless space pancake facts.
All right. And for our final story tonight, Tim Burchett spoke with Newsmax. Newsmax reported. Tim Burchett, Republican U.S. Representative from Tennessee, was interviewed by Newsmax, the conservative news outlet and Giant Robot, on Saturday. Quote, "I am very concerned about the rights and welfare of trans and non-binary people all over America. There have been an alarming number of laws passed across many U.S. states that strip rights, protections, and care for these at-risk populations," unquote, Burchett said. Quote, But don't you think that we should be concerned over the Pentagon's lack of transparency about UFOs, unquote? Newsmax asked in a booming mechanical voice that caused glass window panes to shatter on the set. Burchett responded that he didn't think that UFOs were really a very relevant issue in the Pentagon, and that the US Department of Defense's central concern is about national security. He added that while he thought that there may be some objects and phenomena in the atmosphere still unexplained by science, he couldn't think of any substantial connection between such phenomena and aerospace defense. Quote, "I really wish that everybody would stop conflating UFOs with national security issues," unquote, Burchett said. He added that what the public should really be talking about is ensuring that all people are housed and fed, that all Americans should be provided the same opportunities, and also that ecosystems and wildlife should be protected both at home and abroad. Mecha Kaiju Newsmax responded, quote, "Error, error does not compute," unquote. The interview quickly ended after this, as the representative's eardrums had both ruptured amid concerns that the studio lot may collapse. Before we go, if you enjoy this show, we would like you to please consider subscribing to our channel, Ufo Sunset. Please also hit the like button and hit the notification bell icon if you'd like to get notified about upcoming videos. And come and join our cozy, intimate live chat. A great plus for joining the live chat is that you can give us constructive feedback live on the air, especially if we make any factual errors. You can also join our Discord, a temporary link to which can be found in the episode description.
Fun.
Please be sure to check out our respective content. I can be found at the Earth YouTube channel. All of the videos there were made by me and not the fictional character Telesma Blue Orb. Visit Luis Cayetano's website. We're sorry you couldn't make it tonight, Luis, by the way. That is ufologyiscorrupt.com, and you can find Jeff Knox's daily posts on history and the science of UFOs on Twitter or Facebook. Jeff Knox spends all of his time studying UFOs, literally, and he doesn't make any money off of it. So please, please, please consider visiting his Patreon and becoming his patron. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Louise. Thank you, Blue Shift Radio, John Payne, and the other person whose name is Mindforked. Thank you. Thank you, Mindforked. Thank you all. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that you all had a wonderful time.
I did. Everybody have a nice weekend.